You ever wonder if the laws in the Bible, like the Ten Commandments, were really all that unique? Or did the writers just kind of borrow them from older neighboring cultures? It's a huge question, one that scholars have been wrestling with for over a century, especially when you start digging up ancient legal codes that are way older than the time of Moses. So let's get into it. Let's unpack this fascinating historical puzzle. Okay, so our investigation really kicks off with a genuine ancient legal puzzle. For years now, archaeologists have been uncovering these law codes all over the ancient Near East, and some of them are hundreds of years older than the biblical texts. And when you put them side by side, wow, you find some pretty remarkable similarities. Okay, just look at this. On the left, you've got a law from Mesopotamia from around 1770 BC. On the right, a law from the book of Exodus. They both deal with this super specific situation, one ox goring another one to death. I mean, they're almost identical. It's not just a similar idea, the solution is exactly the same. So what in the world is going on here? And this is the question that just blows the whole debate wide open. When you see parallels this striking, it's really easy to just jump to the conclusion that, hey, the biblical writers must have just copied what their neighbors were already doing. But is it really that simple? Is that the whole story? Or is there maybe something else going on just beneath the surface? Well, most scholars today would say, hold on, it's a little more nuanced than that. The consensus isn't that it was a wholesale copy-paste job. It's more that all these societies were part of what one scholar called a single widespread customary law. Think of it like this. There was a shared legal language, a common framework that everybody in the region just understood. The Israelites were speaking that language for sure, but they were about to say something very, very different with it. So here's the key. You gotta look past what looks the same and start hunting for the differences. And trust me, this is where it gets really interesting, because the ways the biblical laws are different, well, they reveal a totally radical new vision for society and for justice. And these differences, they are absolutely profound. First off, the source of the law isn't some human king, it's God himself. Human life is treated as supremely valuable because people are made in God's image. The punishments show incredible restraint compared to their neighbors. And get this, class distinctions are basically erased. There's not one law for the rich and another for the poor. And maybe most unique of all, there are these special built-in protections for the most vulnerable people in society. Want to see just how different? Let's talk about punishment. Check this out. This is a law from the famous Code of Hammurabi. If an adopted son verbally disrespects his father, just says, "You are not my father," the punishment is to have his tongue cut out. Other laws in that code talk about cutting off hands or ears or plucking out eyes. And that right there just perfectly highlights one of the biggest, clearest differences. In all of the Bible's laws, there is a complete and total absence of physical mutilation as a punishment. Now, yeah, you have the phrase an eye for an eye, but scholars are clear that was a legal principle of justice, making the penalty fit the crime. It was not a literal command to go around mutilating people. And look at how this all plays out when it comes to social class. In Hammurabi's code, if a citizen hits another citizen, he just pays a silver fine. But if a serf, a lower-class person, commits the exact same offense against a citizen, the serf gets his ear cut off. Your punishment is based on your social status. The biblical code just wipes that away. The penalty is the same for everyone, no matter who you are. All people are equal before the law. Okay, but all those differences in the content of the laws, that's just half the story. The most mind-blowing discovery wasn't about what the laws said. It was about the structure of the whole thing. So back in the 1950s, this scholar, George Mendenhall, he noticed something that everybody else had missed. He realized that the biblical covenants, especially in books like Deuteronomy, followed the exact literary format of a very specific type of political document from the ancient world. The real clue, the smoking gun, wasn't in the individual laws. It was in the blueprint for the entire covenant. And this is that blueprint. It's a Hittite suzerain vassal treaty from the 2nd millennium BC. A suzerain was the great king, the big boss, and a vassal was a lesser king who was under his rule. And these treaties always followed this standard 6-part legal structure. You'd have a preamble to identify the king, a historical section listing all the good stuff the king had done, the actual rules or stipulations, a list of divine witnesses, and then finally a section on blessings and curses. Okay, now look at this. This is incredible. The entire book of Deuteronomy maps perfectly onto that 6-part treaty structure. It has a preamble identifying the king, God. It has a historical prologue talking about what God has already done for Israel. It has the stipulations, that's the laws. It calls on witnesses, heaven and earth. And it wraps up with a big list of blessings and curses. It is a one-to-one perfect structural match. So who cares, right? Why does this even matter? Why would the Bible's authors use a political treaty format to frame God's relationship with his people? Well, the answer is in the most important part of that structure, and it changes absolutely everything. The absolute game changer here is element number 2, the historical prologue. In these ancient treaties, this section was crucial. It wasn't just fluff. The great king would always start by listing all the good things he had already done for his vassal. I saved you from your enemies, I protected your land, I made sure you were prosperous. It basically frames the whole relationship on a foundation of gratitude and trust, not just raw power. And this is the huge theological point. By using this treaty structure, the Bible is making an incredible statement. The laws, the stipulations that come next, are not a checklist for Israel to earn God's favor. The history comes first. God basically says, look, I have already rescued you from slavery in Egypt. I have already saved you. So the laws are meant to be a grateful response to the grace that has already been shown. It's grace, then law. But wait, there's one more twist to this whole thing. This specific treaty structure didn't just carry a massive theological message. It also acted like a kind of hidden timestamp, allowing us to actually date the document itself. You see, this specific 6-part Hittite treaty form, with its big historical prologue and its inclusion of both blessings and curses, was really popular during one specific period of history, the 2nd millennium BC. We're talking about the very time of Moses. But fast forward to the 1st millennium BC, when empires like Assyria were running the show, and the treaty form had changed dramatically. They completely dropped the historical prologue, no more talk about past good deeds. The whole tone becomes harsh, a ruthless imposition of power, and they offered no blessings, only a long, terrifying list of curses if you stepped out of line. So here's the bottom line. The book of Deuteronomy is built on a literary blueprint that was common in the 1400s to 1200s BC, but it had totally fallen out of fashion centuries later. Now, many critics have argued that Deuteronomy was written much, much later, maybe around 600 BC, but a writer in that era just wouldn't have used this ancient, archaic treaty format. I mean, that is a powerful piece of evidence suggesting the document comes from the exact time period it says it does. So, in the end, it really doesn't look like the Bible was just a lazy copy of its neighbors. Instead, as the scholar Robert Vannoy puts it, God used a familiar legal and political form from that specific time in history to structure his unique relationship with his people, a relationship built not on fear, but on a history of rescue and grace. And that just leaves us with one final thought to chew on. We've seen how the form of the text, this ancient treaty structure, is a really strong argument for when it was written. But what does it say that this specific structure, one that puts a king's past acts of grace before any demands of law, was the chosen vehicle for this message? What does the blueprint itself tell us about the one who made the blueprint?